Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The flight begins. Kamala Harris, dressed in a sharp yet understated navy suit, stepped onto the private jet with a faint but genuine smile. After weeks of grueling meetings, public engagements, and navigating complex political landscapes, she had been counting down the days until this trip, a much-needed getaway to the Maldives. It was her sanctuary in the making, a place where the turquoise waters and warm sun promised a temporary reprieve from the ceaseless demands of her life. The jet was a masterpiece of modern luxury. Its interior gleamed with plush cream-colored leather seats, ambient lighting that bathed the cabin in a warm glow, and intricate wood-paneled accents that spoke of impeccable taste. Kamala adjusted the strap of her leather bag, placing it gently in the overhead compartment. As she sank into the soft embrace of her seat, a wave of relief washed over her. For once, she allowed herself to savor a moment of peace. Just as she settled in, a flight attendant appeared at the far end of the aisle. Emily, a tall woman with neatly tied blonde hair, moved gracefully from passenger to passenger. Her professional smile lit up the space, and her pleasant demeanor seemed to put everyone at ease, everyone except Kamala. As Emily approached Kamala's seat, her expression faltered. A subtle hesitation flickered across her face, and the practiced warmth in her smile faded, replaced by an unreadable tension. Kamala, with her keen observational skills, noticed the shift immediately. She nodded politely at Emily, maintaining her composure, but the interaction left her wondering. Emily glanced down at the passenger list in her hand, her gaze lingering a little too long on Kamala's name. With a sharp pivot, she disappeared into the galley. Kamala shrugged off the moment, attributing it to the fatigue of her own mind. She kicked off her heels, leaned back in her chair, and reached for a novel she had been trying to finish for months. Yet, just as she opened to the first page, she felt a lingering gaze from across the aisle. A young woman with sleek black hair, likely in her early 30s, was watching her with a mix of curiosity and admiration. Kamala offered a soft smile. The woman returned the gesture with a slight nod before diving back into her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard in a rhythm that suggested focus and determination. The plane began to taxi, and Kamala allowed herself to relax, or tried to. Emily reappeared, moving swiftly through the cabin to ensure every passenger was comfortable. Her behavior was kind and attentive, but it was clear she was avoiding Kamala. When Emily finally stopped by her seat, it was to wordlessly place a glass of water on her tray. The clink of the glass felt deliberate, a sound that punctuated the awkward tension. "Thank you," Kamala said warmly, her voice steady. Emily responded with a fleeting, tight-lipped smile before retreating. The interaction was brief, yet loaded with something Kamala couldn't quite put her finger on. It wasn't the first time she had encountered microaggressions in her public life, but there was something more deliberate about Emily's behavior. As the plane ascended into the sky, Kamala tried to shake off the strange encounter. She turned her attention to the woman across the aisle, who had been stealing glances in her direction throughout the flight. Their eyes met again, and this time, the woman seemed emboldened. Rising from her seat, she approached Kamala hesitantly. "I'm Sarah." The woman introduced herself in a low voice, leaning slightly into Kamala's space. "Nice to meet you, Sarah," Kamala replied with her signature calm demeanor. "I couldn't help but notice," the flight attendant, Sarah began, her tone cautious but laced with concern. "She doesn't seem to like you very much." Kamala gave a small, measured smile. "I'm sure she's just doing her job." Sarah hesitated, her gaze flicking toward the galley where Emily had disappeared. "Maybe, but it feels off, almost like there's more to it." Kamala appreciated Sarah's concern, but chose not to fan the flames of suspicion. She had faced her share of subtle biases and outright prejudice before. This, she decided, was no different. Still, something about Sarah's intuition struck a chord. Tension in the air. The hum of the jet engines filled the cabin, a low, constant sound that would normally lull even the most anxious traveler into a sense of calm. But for Kamala Harris, peace seemed out of reach. The strange behavior from the flight attendant, Emily, had left a lingering sense of unease, like a shadow that refused to disperse. Despite Kamala's attempts to dismiss it, her instincts told her something deeper was at play. Sarah, the woman who had introduced herself only moments before, stood nearby, clearly torn between sitting back down and sharing whatever was on her mind. Kamala gestured gently toward the seat across from her. "Please have a seat if you'd like." Sarah offered an appreciative smile and took the seat, glancing nervously toward the front of the cabin. "I'm sorry for approaching you like this, but I couldn't keep it to myself," she said in a hushed tone. "There's something about the way she's treating you that doesn't sit right with me. I've worked in customer service for years, and I can tell when someone's acting out of line." Kamala folded her hands in her lap, her expression patient and open. "It's okay, Sarah. I appreciate your concern. Sometimes people carry biases they're not even aware of." Sarah bit her lip and nodded. "Maybe you're right, but it feels deliberate. I saw the way she looked at you. It's not just indifference, it's something worse." Kamala considered this for a moment. Over the years, she had grown used to being treated differently in certain spaces. Her gender, race, and position as a prominent public figure often made her a lightning rod for scrutiny. Still, something about this encounter felt more personal, more purposeful than she had initially realized. As the conversation died down, Emily emerged from the galley once more, her steps brisk, her expression rigid. She carried a tray of drinks, and as she moved past Kamala, she tilted the tray slightly, just enough for a stream of cold liquid to spill onto Kamala's table. "Oh, I'm so sorry," Emily said in a tone that lacked any genuine remorse. Kamala froze for a second, feeling the chill of the spilled drink seeping toward the edge of her seat. She looked up at Emily, her gaze sharp but composed. "It's all right," she replied calmly, reaching for a napkin. Emily didn't offer assistance. Instead, she walked away quickly, her face flushed as though she had been caught in her own misstep. Sarah, watching from across the aisle, visibly bristled. "That wasn't an accident," Sarah whispered fiercely, standing up again. She grabbed a few napkins from the galley and handed them to Kamala. She did that on purpose. Kamala wiped the spill with deliberate calmness, her years of political training allowing her to maintain poise under pressure. "Let's not jump to conclusions, Sarah," she said evenly, though her tone carried an undertone of unease. Sarah exhaled sharply. "I know you were used to dealing with people like her, but someone needs to say something. That's not okay." Before Kamala could respond, a voice crackled over the cabin intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some light turbulence. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." Kamala glanced out the window. The clouds outside had grown denser, the sunlight dimmed by the overcast sky. The jet wobbled slightly, but it was nothing too concerning. She turned her attention back to her book, trying to refocus. But tension had a way of spreading, infecting the air like an unseen toxin. From her peripheral vision, Kamala noticed Emily moving about the cabin with increasing restlessness. Her movements were jerky, her tone clipped as she addressed passengers. The bright, polite facade she had worn earlier was crumbling, revealing something harsher beneath the surface. Sarah sat back in her seat, but didn't take her eyes off Emily. She wasn't letting this go. Every time Emily passed Kamala's seat, Sarah noted how Emily averted her gaze, her lips pressed tightly together. It was no longer subtle, it was blatant. Finally, Emily stopped in front of Kamala again, this time holding out a meal tray. Her hand trembled slightly as she placed it down. "Your meal," she said curtly, not bothering to make eye contact. Kamala looked up at her, searching her face for answers. "Thank you," she said evenly, her tone devoid of irritation, but full of quiet authority. Emily stood there for a beat too long, as if waging an internal battle. Finally, she turned on her heel and strode back toward the galley. Kamala's gaze followed her, her intuition firing on all cylinders. Something was deeply wrong here, and Emily wasn't just uncomfortable, she was angry. Sarah leaned across the aisle again. Are you really going to let her keep doing that? Kamala sighed softly and met Sarah's gaze. It's not about letting her do anything. It's about choosing how I respond. Sometimes silence is the best way to disarm someone. But what if it gets worse? Sarah pressed. Kamala paused, her expression thoughtful. Then we deal with it. The turbulence outside intensified, the jet now rocking slightly with each passing minute. Kamala remained calm, though her unease grew. Emily had been too obvious, too careless for her behavior to be written off as simple dislike. Kamala couldn't help but wonder, was this personal, political, or something else entirely? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice near her shoulder. A different flight attendant, a young man with short brown hair and a kind demeanor, appeared. Miss Harris, is everything okay here? He asked, his tone laced with concern. Kamala looked at him and offered a reassuring nod. I'm fine, thank you. The attendant hesitated, his gaze flicking briefly toward the galley where Emily had vanished. If you need anything, please don't hesitate to ask. Kamala appreciated the offer, but noted the tension in his voice. It was clear that Emily's behavior hadn't gone unnoticed by her colleagues either. Something was brewing beneath the surface of this flight, and Kamala could feel it building, like the storm clouds gathering outside. The hours ticked by, and the cabin settled into an uneasy quiet. Most passengers had fallen asleep or buried themselves in their devices, unaware of the subtle drama playing out. But Kamala's mind remained alert, piecing together the small clues. Emily's hesitation, the deliberate spill, the lingering glances. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from the galley, startling the passengers. Kamala sat upright, exchanging a look with Sarah, whose eyes were wide with alarm. A voice came over the intercom again, but this time it wasn't the pilot. It was Emily. Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats immediately, she said, her voice strained and uneven. Kamala frowned. Something was very wrong. Sarah whispered urgently, Did you hear that? She sounds off. Kamala nodded, her instincts on high alert. Her years of experience in handling crises had taught her one thing. When chaos loomed, you stayed calm, observant, and ready. As Emily stepped back into the cabin, her face was pale, her expression unreadable. She stopped in the aisle, her eyes locking with Kamala's for the briefest moment before she said something that sent chills through the cabin. I need everyone to remain seated. There's been an issue. The passengers murmured nervously, and Kamala's pulse quickened. An issue. What had started as a subtle hostility was now spiraling into something far more dangerous, and Kamala was about to find herself at the center of it. The flight was no longer just a journey. It was about to become a test of courage, resilience, and resolve. A breaking point. The tension in the cabin had thickened into something tangible. Passengers shifted nervously in their seats, exchanging murmurs and uneasy glances. Kamala Harris sat upright, her sharp instincts on high alert. Emily's strained announcement, "There's been an issue," echoed in her mind. It wasn't just Emily's tone that concerned her, but the deliberate pause, the weight of her words, and the underlying sense of chaos about to erupt. Sarah, seated across the aisle, looked visibly anxious. She whispered, "What do you think is going on?" Kamala didn't respond immediately. Years in politics had taught her that speculation did no good in moments of uncertainty. She scanned the cabin. The young flight attendant, the one who had checked on her earlier, stood by the galley, his eyes darting toward Emily as if waiting for a cue. Something wasn't right. Emily reappeared, walking briskly toward the front of the cabin where the cockpit door stood closed. Her face was pale, her normally composed demeanor replaced with a visible unease. It was almost as if she were wrestling with a choice, one she hadn't expected to make. Kamala turned her gaze back to Sarah, lowering her voice. Let's stay calm for now. There's no need to escalate things until we know what's happening. Sarah nodded but fidgeted with her hands. I still think this has something to do with you. She's been acting strange since the moment you boarded. Kamala exhaled slowly. Let's focus on staying aware. A loud click drew everyone's attention. The cockpit door had cracked open slightly, and a muffled conversation spilled out. Emily stood just outside the door, speaking in low, hurried tones to someone inside. Her posture was tense, her movements jittery. It was clear that whatever was happening had reached a breaking point. Passengers began to whisper louder now, the unease spreading like ripples in water. One man in a business suit stood and walked toward the galley, trying to get Emily's attention. "Excuse me, miss. What's going on? We have a right to know." Emily turned sharply, her face strained but composed. "Sir, I need you to sit down. Everything is under control." Her tone was firm, almost aggressive. The man frowned but returned to his seat, muttering under his breath. Kamala watched the exchange closely. Something about Emily's choice of words, under control, bothered her. It felt like a mask, words used to conceal rather than reassure. 10 minutes passed, though it felt like an eternity. Emily returned to the cabin, walking slowly now, scanning the passengers as if searching for someone. When her eyes met Kamala's, they lingered, cold and unyielding. Kamala didn't flinch. She held the gaze with quiet strength, refusing to give in to intimidation. Finally, Emily spoke, her voice carrying an unusual edge. "Miss Harris, may I have a word with you in private?" The cabin fell into a hush. Passengers turned their heads, their curiosity piqued. Sarah leaned forward, alarmed. "You don't have to go with her," she whispered fiercely. Kamala smiled faintly, a calm reassurance that belied the storm brewing inside her. "It's okay." She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood gracefully, her every movement deliberate and composed. Emily gestured toward the back of the plane, near the galley. Kamala followed her, her heels clicking softly against the carpeted aisle. When they reached the narrow galley space, Emily turned to face her. "You don't belong here," Emily said abruptly, her voice low and venomous. Kamala froze, her calm mask intact. "I'm sorry." "You heard me," Emily hissed. "People like you think you can go anywhere, sit in any seat, live in luxury that you don't deserve, but you don't belong." For a moment, Kamala stared at her, searching Emily's face for some kind of explanation. There was nothing but bitterness and anger. "Why do you feel that way?" Kamala asked, her tone measured but firm. Emily scoffed, her voice rising slightly. "Because people like you take everything. You don't deserve the respect you get. You don't deserve to be sitting on this plane. You act like you're better than everyone else, like you're not." Kamala's pulse quickened, but her voice remained steady. "I don't know what I've done to offend you personally, but your behavior is unacceptable, and it needs to stop." Emily took a step closer, her face inches from Kamala's. "You think I'm scared of you? You think just because you're Kamala Harris, you can intimidate me? I'm not afraid of your title, your power, or your politics." Kamala didn't back down. "I don't need you to be afraid of me, Emily. I need you to treat every passenger on this flight with the respect they deserve, including me." The words hung in the air like a challenge. For a moment, Emily faltered, her bravado cracking. But before she could respond, the young male flight attendant appeared at the galley entrance, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. "Emily, what's going on here?" Emily turned sharply. "Stay out of this, James." James looked from Emily to Kamala, his brow furrowing. "Miss Harris, is everything okay?" Kamala nodded. "Thank you for checking, James. I believe we're finished here." Emily opened her mouth to protest, but James stepped between them slightly. "Emily, the captain needs to speak with you. Now." Emily's face darkened, but she didn't argue. With one last glare in Kamala's direction, she turned and stormed toward the cockpit. Kamala returned to her seat, her face calm, but her thoughts racing. Sarah was waiting for her, practically vibrating with curiosity. What happened? What did she say? Kamala offered a tight smile. She's dealing with some personal issues, I think. Sarah wasn't buying it. She attacked you verbally, didn't she? I could see it in her face. Kamala sighed softly. Some people carry anger in ways that hurt those around them. It's not about me, it's about her. Sarah shook her head in disbelief. You're far more patient than I would be. Kamala glanced out the window at the darkening clouds. The storm outside mirrored the turbulence inside the plane. Emily's hostility was deeply rooted. This wasn't just about Kamala being a political figure or a public personality. It was about what Kamala represented: progress, change, and a breaking of barriers that some people still resisted. The intercom crackled again, this time with the captain's calm voice. Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing some unexpected turbulence, but we will stabilize soon. Please remain seated. Kamala could feel the shift in the cabin's energy. The other passengers were restless, some asking the crew what was going on. Tension now hung in the air like a heavy curtain, and Kamala couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over yet. 15 minutes later, Emily emerged from the cockpit, her expression unreadable. She walked down the aisle slowly, her movements deliberate. Her gaze lingered on Kamala again, but this time something flickered in her eyes, something unsettled. Kamala's instincts screamed at her to stay alert. This isn't over, not yet. Emily stopped in front of Kamala's seat and spoke in a voice loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. Miss Harris, I'll need to see you again. Now. Sarah gasped audibly, and other passengers turned their heads, shocked. The hostility in Emily's tone was impossible to ignore this time. Kamala stood again, calm as ever, but she knew one thing for certain. Whatever was coming next would change the course of this flight, and not just for her. The storm, both inside and outside the plane, was about to break. The moment of truth. Kamala stood once again, her every move deliberate and graceful despite the mounting tension in the cabin. All eyes were on her now, passengers whispering nervously, their curiosity a thin veil for the discomfort creeping into the air. Sarah looked up at her with wide, worried eyes. You don't have to do this, she whispered urgently, grabbing Kamala's hand lightly. Kamala smiled, a calming gesture. It's all right, Sarah. She gently pulled her hand away and followed Emily, whose rigid posture exuded barely contained hostility. Kamala walked with her head held high, her composure unshakable as they made their way toward the galley at the back of the jet. Emily stopped abruptly, spun around, and faced Kamala, her face flushed, her expression twisted with frustration and something darker, resentment. Do you know what you represent? Emily asked through gritted teeth. Kamala tilted her head slightly, her calm gaze fixed on Emily. Why don't you tell me? Emily's voice trembled as she spoke, though whether from anger or something else wasn't clear. You stand for everything that people like me, people like my family, have fought against. You parade around as if you've earned this life, this power, when everything you have has been handed to you because of politics, because of diversity quotas, because people like you take and take, while hardworking people like us get left behind. The words hung in the air, acidic and raw. For a moment, Kamala said nothing. She allowed the silence to stretch, giving Emily's bitterness room to echo back at her. Finally, Kamala spoke, her tone steady but edged with the weight of her conviction. Is that what you believe, Emily? That I'm here because I've taken something from you? Emily's lips trembled slightly. It's not just me. It's everyone who sees through people like you. You don't belong here. Kamala folded her hands in front of her, her stance grounded, powerful without being confrontational. Emily, I'm sorry you feel that way, but let me explain something to you. Emily shifted uncomfortably but didn't break eye contact. Kamala continued, her voice soft yet piercing. Nothing I have has been handed to me. Every step I've taken, every milestone I've reached, I earned through hard work, sacrifice, and resilience. Do you know what it's like to be told you can't sit in a room, can't hold a position, can't make decisions because of the way you look or who you are? I faced that my entire life, and instead of letting it make me bitter, I chose to let it make me better. Emily's face faltered, her earlier bravado crumbling slightly. Kamala took a step forward, not aggressive, just confident. You talk about hard work. I believe in it too, but I don't believe in tearing others down to feel better about myself. Your anger doesn't come from me. It comes from something deeper, something you've allowed to fester. And I'm not your enemy, Emily. Emily's breathing quickened, as though she was struggling to keep control. Tears welled up in her eyes, unbidden and unexpected. I've been working so hard for years, and it feels like it's all for nothing. People like you get celebrated, and people like me get forgotten. Kamala's gaze softened, her voice lowering just enough to reach the raw place Emily had exposed. You are not forgotten, but this anger, this resentment, doesn't serve you. It keeps you trapped. You think I'm standing in your way, but I'm not. We all have our battles to fight, Emily. Yours is different from mine, but it's no less valid. The question is, how will you fight it? Will you let it destroy you, or will you rise above it? Emily's shoulders slumped as the tears broke free. She quickly wiped at her face with trembling hands, unable to respond. James, the young flight attendant, appeared suddenly in the galley doorway, his expression concerned. Emily, the captain wants to see you immediately, he said gently. Emily nodded weakly and turned to leave, but not before casting one last glance at Kamala. This time, her gaze held less venom, just confusion and exhaustion. As Emily disappeared into the cockpit, Kamala turned to James, who regarded her with admiration and relief. Miss Harris, James began, his voice full of quiet awe. Thank you for staying so calm. I'm sorry you had to deal with that. Kamala smiled faintly. It's not your fault, James. Thank you for being here and doing your job with integrity. Kamala returned to her seat, where Sarah sat waiting, perched at the edge of her chair. Well, Sarah asked anxiously, what happened? Kamala settled back into her seat, her face calm and unshaken. We had a conversation. Sarah frowned. That's it? A conversation? Kamala nodded. Sometimes that's all it takes to change the direction of something, or someone. Sarah let out a huff of disbelief. You're amazing, you know that. I would have lost it. She was so awful to you. Kamala gave her a reassuring smile. Anger is easy, compassion is harder, but it's what changes people. The rest of the flight passed in relative calm, though a new energy seemed to hum in the cabin. Passengers who had witnessed the tension seemed more relaxed now, reassured by Kamala's composure. When the plane finally landed, Kamala stood to retrieve her bag. As she turned to leave the cabin, she saw Emily standing near the exit, her posture rigid but her expression softer. As Kamala approached, Emily swallowed hard and murmured, Miss Harris, I'm sorry. Kamala paused, studying her face. Thank you, Emily. Apologies take courage. Emily blinked back tears and nodded, unable to say more. Kamala stepped off the plane, the tropical warmth of the Maldives wrapping around her like a long-awaited embrace. For the first time in days, she breathed deeply, letting the tension from the flight dissolve into the sea breeze. Sarah, now a few steps behind her, grinned as she caught up. You know, you could have called her out, humiliated her. But instead, you changed something in her. That's incredible. Kamala smiled at her, the sunlight catching the determination in her eyes. Sometimes people just need to be reminded that there's another way to see the world. Hate doesn't solve anything, but understanding? That changes everything. As they stepped onto the runway, the events of the flight already felt like a distant memory. The Maldives awaited, turquoise waters, golden sands, and the promise of renewal. But Kamala knew that the real victory wasn't just in reaching her destination. It was in standing firm, choosing grace over anger, and leaving an impact that would ripple far beyond that flight. For Emily, for Sarah, and for everyone watching, Kamala Harris had once again proven that strength wasn't always about fighting back, it was about rising above.